Welcome to the Statrix. This is your world, and the government helped create it. The state builds transportation projects like roads and trains, approves the safety of your food, runs the schools, prints the money, controls much of your healthcare, and so much more. The government does good things and bad things, but with the government doing so much, it can be hard to imagine what the world would look like if the government did less. If there were no public schools, what would schools look like? Would there even be schools? If there were no government food inspection, would we all get sick? If there were no public transportation, would we be able to get around? A world where the government does less could be better or it could be worse, but many of us don't even think about what it might look like. That's not your fault. Most people accept the reality presented to them. The lack of imagination is the biggest challenge we face when fighting for a freer society. People simply can't imagine how some things would work without the government because, due to the government, they've probably never seen it. What would the world look like outside of the Statrix? What if the government did none of those things? Would we need to walk to work? Would our lunch be safe? Would we have to pay for it with seashells? Most of us don't think about it, partially because it's hard to imagine life outside the Statrix when the Statrix is all you've ever known. To see past the Statrix, we need to figure out how we got here, how, through 7 steps, the government has corrupted our imaginations. Often, the government builds something to help poorer people, which is an admirable goal. They might build a train or a public school. Of course, the government doesn't ask for its money. It has taxes. Thus, it can build things no one wants, or maybe build things everyone wants. Now there's stuff that wasn't there before, and people start reorganizing their lives around it. They live in different neighborhoods and work in different areas. The world looks very different from before. There used to be a moderately priced private school near the public school, but it had to convince people to give them money, which the government school doesn't. Very hard to compete. Oh, and that guy who used to have a local carpool service, he went out of business too because of the subsidized train. Unless you're rich, there's now only one place to go to school and one way to get into town. Those virtual monopolies create a lot of interested parties. Teachers unionize and make sure the school is run on their terms. Transit workers revolt when an underused train is cut. Even property owners, who like subsidized transit and benefit from higher property values, will fight to make sure nothing changes. With no competition, the government's not too encouraged to do a great job running the trains or the schools, but there are no other options unless you're rich. It gets worse. Even when someone tries to come up with ways around the failing schools or the trains, the government tries to prohibit it. The poor get hurt the most because they can't afford to get out of the system. Now you're in the Statrix. Look around you. Looks normal. Public schools are necessary, of course, because there are no private schools. How would that even work? Public transit is necessary because where are the private options? In 1989, Russian President Boris Yeltsin visited an American grocery store and he couldn't believe his eyes. He marveled at the produce, the checkout counter. He asked the manager if he had to have a special education to manage the store. He said, even the Politburo doesn't have this choice, not even Mr. Gorbachev. Burrus was having a red pill moment. And if Boris Yeltsin couldn't believe it, imagine all the normal Soviet citizens who also didn't know what they were missing, so they never demanded it. If 70 years ago the government created state-run grocery stores, implemented them with taxes, reorganized the food industry around them, crowded out private grocery stores, colluded with the grocers union, failed to run the stores adequately, and then prohibited private grocery stores and services like Peapod, people would be unable to imagine how it could be otherwise. We'd be like Boris Yeltsin. But that's the Soviet Union. We're different, right? What do you think is impossible? People say private schools could work, even for the poor, but you've never seen a private school that wasn't for rich people, so that sounds silly. Private transportation services? Pure science fiction. Private medicine? Private food inspection? Private non-state controlled taxis? No way. But is this possible? Is this possible? Is this possible? Is this possible? What's possible? I'm Trevor Burrus. To read more, check out the link to my article. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Ben Johnson. I have a long history of leading unions in my home state of Vermont. I was president of the state affiliate for the American Federation of Teachers, and then spent 3 years as president of the state affiliate of the AFL-CIO. Now, I support a policy that makes other union leaders furious. In fact, it's the single issue they've spent more money and time than any other opposing. I support right to work. For those unfamiliar, right to work is a policy that prevents unions from forcing workers to join up at a unionized workplace, which also means they can't compel you to pay dues just to be able to work, hence, right to work. Though unions argue that their bargaining benefits all workers, on its face there's something screwy about the idea that an employer can take money from your paycheck against your will and give it to a private third party that you may want nothing to do with, and whose very existence you may oppose on philosophical, financial, or strategic grounds. Let me tell you a story that explains why I switched sides. In 2009, we started a project in Vermont to organize childcare workers. There were thousands of individuals and centers providing childcare in Vermont. We wanted to organize them. So we got legislation passed that declared the state of Vermont was their employer. Why'd we do it? The real value proposition to the union was that because they would be covered by the contract, we could communicate with them on politics. And because they each saw 5 to 6 families a day through their childcare businesses, they could help us create a powerhouse political machine that would reach every nook and cranny in every corner of the state. Do you scoff at an army of childcare providers? You do so at your peril. But that army ended when we lost a Supreme Court decision. I regret even having tried now. Securing them as political tools was more important to us than raising their wages. Which begs the bigger question. Why are unions, which are supposed to be spending their time negotiating the wages and conditions with employers, spending so much time and resources on politics? It's because union professionals believe they know what's in their members' best interests, spending dues to push for policies like single-payer healthcare, despite such policies having nothing to do with the purpose of a union. Unfortunately, I don't expect to bring union officers to my view anytime soon. To them, my arguments are just tools that the forces of capitalism use to bust the union. It's time to see if unions can survive on their own, by persuading non-members to join, not forcing them. To learn more, read the full article on our website. I'm Ben Johnson. Thanks for watching.
More so than any other state, California has embraced so-called green energy. The state has banned offshore drilling, passed draconian auto emission standards, imposed wind and solar energy mandates, with Governor Jerry Brown setting a goal of 50% renewable energy by 2030. But what have these policies done for Californians? Over the 1990s, California's electricity generation capacity decreased by 2%, while consumption increased by 11%, an unsustainable trend. Fuel economy standards actually make cars less safe, costing thousands of lives over time. And anti-pollution regulations accelerated California's deindustrialization. Aerospace manufacturing shifted to states with lower energy costs. In the 10 years to 2015, Southern California's industrial base shed 60% of its workforce. That means a socially regressive economy. California has America's largest number of billionaires, but also its highest poverty rate at 23%. California's no-growth planning policies increase downward mobility, particularly among Latinos. California-born Latinos actually have shorter lifespans than their parents. For California's elites who live within 5 miles of the coast, the folks who run the state, air conditioning is a renewable resource provided by the cool waters of the California Current. But many in the state's impoverished lower middle class live 100 miles away in the sweltering interior. On the coast in liberal Marin County, the average summer electricity bill is $250 a month, but in the San Joaquin Valley, it's twice as high. How have those suffering from California's green policies not managed to change things? One reason is enormous political spending by special interests. But there's also an intellectual history. California universities have long been home to thinkers like Paul Ehrlich, author of the 1968 bestseller The Population Bomb, which wrongly predicted millions of deaths due to development and overpopulation. California Governor Jerry Brown seems to have been influenced by Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, author of Small is Beautiful, that phrase being one of the central planks of Brown's first term in office. Næss opposed economic growth and industrial development because the earth does not belong to mankind. Most people care about the environment, but every policy comes with trade-offs, and pretending there are none for green policies doesn't do humanity any good. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. To learn more, read the full article on our website. Thanks for watching.
Dear college students, you probably know that paying to go to school also means you pay for a lot of frivolous things. For example, Louisiana State University recently built a lazy river as part of an $85 million recreation center. You also pay for a lot of clubs you might not care about. Your school might have, say, a Muggle Quidditch team. NYU students even founded a zombie defense league. But what does that do to help educate students? That may sound trivial, but have you ever thought about the fact that you're paying for your school's more political clubs too? You might be conservative, libertarian, or you might not know what you think about politics, but you're still paying for your school's feminist student collective, socialist club, and others. That's all paid for via student fees, surcharges on your tuition bill used to fund clubs and other campus organizations. Explicitly partisan groups like college Republicans and Democrats are excluded, but other politically motivated groups aren't, like the Public Interest Research Group, which was founded by Ralph Nader to promote progressive causes. How do you feel about paying groups to fight for causes you don't agree with, or causes that you might even fight against? Take the University of Minnesota's 5-campus school system. Students there pay a total of $35 million in student fees, which comes to between $336 and $837 per student per semester. Some of that money is used to fund organizations, clubs, or causes that many students are ideologically or religiously opposed to. If you assume every other state public university system brings in a similar amount, that's $1.75 billion a year nationwide. Some lawmakers have started to take notice, but with little success. In Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker introduced a budget proposal that would allow students to opt out of such student fees, but the state legislature turned him down. In Minnesota, State Representative Drew Christensen introduced a bill that would have done the same. Unfortunately, it was opposed by students who didn't want to lose their club's special funding. None of this changes unless students get active and stand up to their schools. Fight it on campus, fight it in your state house, and fight for your right to use your money how you see fit. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Thanks for watching. Remember this guy?
In the end, it was the candidate, Hillary Clinton, the future president of the United States, who wanted ducks on the ground. So by God, we will give ducks on the ground.
That's Robert Creamer, Democratic political operative and husband of Illinois Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. In late 2016, the investigative journalism nonprofit Project Veritas released undercover footage of his associates admitting to hiring mentally ill and homeless people to provoke violence at Trump campaign rallies, and brainstorming ways to use lax voter identification laws to influence elections. That's bad enough. But there's even more about Robert Creamer you need to know, and it provides insights into the shocking tactics used by the Democratic Party's political machine. As a political consultant, Creamer has had a number of high-profile clients, including Democratic campaigns for Howard Dean for Vermont governor and his wife's campaigns for Congress. He's also been hired by groups such as ACORN, the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Creamer laid out his political strategy in his 2007 book, in which he advocates amnesty and citizenship for illegal aliens, calling them, quote, a gigantic bloc of progressive voters, a bloc that could be decisive in the battle for the future. Creamer emphasized the need to put individuals living in the United States illegally on a path to citizenship, so that they would be eligible to vote in 2012 and 2016. Wresting healthcare away from private insurers, he implied, will create lasting reliance on the federal government. As his wife Jan Schakowsky put it in a 2009 speech, a public option will put the private insurance industry out of business and lead to single-payer healthcare. Couple this with amnesty for millions of new voters, he adds, and you have a recipe which will ensure the far left's supremacy in American politics. And when Creamer got in trouble with the law, Democrats had his back. In 2005, Creamer was indicted on 16 charges of tax violations and bank fraud. He pleaded guilty. Despite this, he received some 200 letters of support during his trial from left-wing notables, including Senator Richard Durbin, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Obama campaign chief strategist David Axelrod. Ultimately, Creamer served 5 months in federal prison and another 11 months under house arrest. Perhaps Creamer's influence on Democratic politics is best summarized by his partner, Scott Fovel.
It doesn't matter what the frickin' legal and ethics people say. We need to win this motherfucker.
For Bob Creamer and Scott Fovel, victory is always the goal. and the means are always negotiable. To learn more, read the full article on our website. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Thanks for watching.
Meet Bill de Blasio, mayor of New York since 2014. De Blasio's position in the most powerful office in the nation's largest city ought to concern every American. One doesn't have to look far to find a substantial track record of corruption and ties to radical groups. In 1988, de Blasio traveled to Nicaragua, where he came to support the Russian-backed Sandinista National Liberation Front, the socialist dictatorship opposed by the American government and internationally criticized for human rights abuses, mass executions, and oppression of indigenous peoples. Upon returning to New York, de Blasio raised money for the Sandinistas and volunteered at the pro-Sandinista Nicaragua Solidarity Network of Greater New York. He also honeymooned in Cuba, in violation of the United States ban on travel to that communist nation. In May 2013, de Blasio wallowed in fourth place, a long shot in the Democratic primary, but then came a fateful endorsement from the Executive Council of SEIU 1199, New York's local branch of the Service Employees International Union. SEIU 1199 donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the de Blasio campaign and spent $2 million in mailers to get its 200,000 members to the polls. The union got what it paid for. SEIU 1199's president was rewarded with a spot on de Blasio's transition team, which unsurprisingly filled the administration with many of the union's members. De Blasio is also tied to the now-defunct Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, a group whose members have been convicted of voter registration fraud. De Blasio and Acorn leader Bertha Lewis met every month to talk about strategy and getting out the vote. Of course, a group involved in voter registration fraud helping with get-out-the-vote efforts is deeply concerning. De Blasio was also a client of public relations and campaign communications consulting firm Berlin Rosen, which was co-founded by former Acorn employee Valerie Berlin. After de Blasio was elected mayor, Berlin Rosen helped set up and manage the Campaign for One New York to promote his agenda. The nonprofit took substantial sums from entities with business before the city, including the American Federation of Teachers, which was involved in contract negotiations at the time. The AFT has supported rubber rooms for teachers in New York, rooms where teachers involved in misconduct go to get paid while they do no teaching at all, since the union has made them too difficult to fire. Ever wonder what it would be like if radical unions and their allies gained control of New York City? Wonder no more. Bill de Blasio is in charge. To learn more, read the full article on our website. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Did you know that our secular government funds almost half the $3.9 billion budget of the supposedly religious Catholic Charities USA? An official church nonprofit network, they do a lot of great work. They run soup kitchens feeding millions of people, house the homeless, provide disaster relief, clothing, and much, much more. But while helping the poor is an imperative in Catholic teaching, using government funds to do so is dangerous. It can harm the poor and society, as well as hinder Catholic Charities' ability to function as a religious institution. Prior to Catholic Charities' founding in 1910, Archbishop John Hughes of New York taught that while many poor persons were victims of circumstances, many others were victims of their own self-destructive behavior, and so religion had the power to change their way of life and lead them out of poverty. Catholic Charities USA followed that mission for decades, but with the modernizing spirit of Vatican II in the 1960s, Catholic Charities lost its emphasis on personal responsibility and shifted the blame for poverty to capitalist society. This coincided with LBJ's so-called war on poverty, which enormously expanded the welfare state. The federal government increasingly contracted with Catholic Charities USA to provide services, boosting their taxpayer funding until by the mid-1980s it amounted to more than 60% of their budget. But government money comes at a price. One supervisor at a Catholic Charities clinic put it bluntly, "We get government funds, so we are not Catholic." Catholic Charities in Albany, New York went so far as to propose making abortion referrals. This reliance on government influences their lobbying activities too. Catholic Charities opposed the 1996 welfare reform law, calling it a national social catastrophe, even though poverty rates declined for years after a Democratic president signed the bill. Excessive government funding also harms would-be donors, because good works don't just benefit recipients,
they also improve the souls of the donors. The Catholic idea of subsidiarity teaches that caring for others should start with families and local communities helping each other, and larger entities such as the state shouldn't displace their role. Pope John Paul II warned about what he called the social assistance state that robs civil society of its responsibility. Years before, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a liberal Catholic Democrat, voiced the same warning. Western civilization is doomed if nonprofit charities are squeezed out of existence or slowly absorbed by government. It's time to return responsibility to the American people to step up to help their fellow man. I'm Scott Walter. To learn more, click the link to the article on our website. Thanks for watching.
Over the past century, estimates of deaths under communism range from 85 to 100 million people. To many, the collapse of the Soviet Union and increasing economic freedom in China show the failure of Marxism. Yet many remain convinced that peaceful and productive communism is possible. When asked about the Soviet Union, they may respond, but that's not real communism, believing that dictatorship was the problem, Stalin was the problem, not Marxist ideas. But communist dictatorships are not an accident. Rather, they're the natural outcome of Marxism put into practice. You, the friendly communist, might think you're nonviolent and wouldn't create an authoritarian regime if it were you in power, but if you're truly dedicated to bringing about communism no matter what, you would. Don't believe me? Let's imagine your communist revolution. Be it violent or democratic, congrats, welcome to power. It's time to organize your new classless society. The first thing you might find is not everyone is so happy you're there. Society didn't unanimously settle on your vision. So many people aren't going to give up their property to be socialized willingly. But you don't believe in their right to private property anyway, so no matter. Off to the gulag with them. What was theirs is now the people's. That wealth might sustain the proletariat for a while, but eventually you're going to have to start producing new goods for the people. From each according to their ability, to each according to their need. But if people don't get to keep what they make, they don't have an incentive motivating them. Not to worry, the new socialist man will take care of that. Without capitalism driving him to be greedy, his mind will be refocused to take care of all the people. Except that didn't happen in any attempt at communism ever, because man's greed might be heightened by society, but millennia of evolution have also driven a desire to collect goods for oneself. So how do you motivate people to keep working and provide for society? Those that don't meet their quotas, off to the gulag. And those gulags better be pretty bad too if you want people to be incentivized not to end up there. And if you don't get your gulag sending decisions just right, you might end up crippling your production instead, starving millions. And if indeed conditions start to deteriorate, you can't let the people know it's better elsewhere, or else they'll want to leave, worsening your production difficulties. So hello Iron Curtain and shooting runaways at the border. You don't have to have a violent evil goal to end up with evil if the demands of reality necessitate violence and evil to bring about your goal. Stop comparing the supposed evils of capitalism in reality to communism in your fantasy and start comparing the realities of both. One has lifted billions of people out of poverty, the other has killed 100 million of them. I'm Joseph Klein, thanks for watching.
The film industry is famous for its left-wing political activism, much of which is focused on improving conditions for workers, women, and minorities. But then, why have we seen major progressive Hollywood political donors outed as hypocrites, privately abusing their positions of power to assault or harass precisely those groups? That's because behind the facade of Hollywood's language of progressivism lies a slew of business interests that better explains executives' ties to the Democratic Party than a desire for social justice. Hollywood has picked the Democratic Party as its vehicle to write favorable regulations. The film industry has become hugely reliant on tax credits to finance productions, that is, subsidies from governments. That's why you see so many productions that are, quote, made in Georgia or Vancouver, Canada. Both of those locations offer massive subsidies to attract productions. Democratic legislatures in New York and California have been pressured by the industry to compete. In 2013, the New York Daily News found that the film and TV industry had given nearly $1 million in campaign donations to Governor Cuomo and the legislature, timed with NBC's decision to keep The Tonight Show in New York. Now, New York's tax credits offer to pay up to 30% of a production's cost, which comes directly from the taxpayer. Numerous reports show that states aren't getting their money's worth. When Michigan legislators analyzed their state's tax credit program's return on investment, they, quote, discovered they were distributing over $100,000 for every full-time equivalent position created by film credits. There's also international trade. The current head of the MPAA, Charles Rifkin, was a trade representative in the Obama State Department. Wonder why they'd pick a trade representative? Because China's film industry is expected to exceed $20 billion by 2021. Currently, North America's is only $12 billion. It's not a surprise, then, that Hollywood's choice for president, Hillary Clinton, supported the MPAA-endorsed Trans-Pacific Partnership for as long as politically viable. That's not to say free trade with China is a bad idea, but it is to say that buying a political party to make your issues their priority is corrupt. Let's be clear. When you see Hollywood executives holding massive fundraisers for Democrats, it's not because they care about women's rights or good working conditions for the little guys. It's because they're a special interest who have found their political vehicle to make a buck. To learn more, read the full article on our website. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Thanks for watching.
Ever wonder how the political left got so much money? Believe it or not, a lot of that money was originally meant for conservatives. Ever heard of the Pew Charitable Trusts? They played a key role in convincing President Clinton to adopt tough air pollution regulations that created major difficulties for the oil industry, even though the trust's money comes from the Sun Oil Corporation and Joseph Pew despised government regulations. What about the Daniels Fund? Benefactor Bill Daniels spent World War II flying Navy planes. He downed 11 enemy planes and received numerous medals. Yet after his death, his philanthropy rejected a grant proposal to preserve World War II aircraft for a Smithsonian exhibit. Why? A program officer said the fund wouldn't support, quote, monuments of war. The Daniels Fund board has since restored respect for donor intent, but we could just as easily have given examples from philanthropies created by Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and many others, all founded by conservative businessmen whose billions are now controlled by the left. Why does this keep happening? Let's look at the MacArthur Foundation. John D. MacArthur believed in free markets and famously despised environmentalists. By 1970, MacArthur was one of only 5 billionaires in America. After a health scare, MacArthur's lawyer advised he reorganize his estate. To avoid his money going to the IRS, he established a foundation. And he decided to let the foundation's board define its mission. He said, "I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to make money. You guys will have to figure out when I'm dead what to do with it." After he died, his son J. Roderick entered the picture. A committed liberal, he'd fought bitterly with his father for decades. After Dad died, he waged a massive legal battle against the foundation and eventually won, ousting all opposing board members and taking control. Now the MacArthur Foundation opposes free speech, gives fellowships near exclusively to left-wing thinkers, and works to cut carbon emissions, crippling industry. What can donors learn from this grim history? Don't trust future generations, and if you decide to set up a foundation, don't let others figure out what to do with your legacy. Give strict guidance and choose staff and board members with great care. You should seriously consider term limiting the foundation's life. Or reject a foundation entirely. Instead, give while you live, so you have maximum control, and leave your estate to the groups you already trust. For more, read our book on donor intent by Martin Morse Wooster. I'm Scott Walter. Thanks for watching.
With tax reform in the news, you'll be hearing a lot about flattening the tax code, meaning in part getting rid of various deductions that benefit special interests. Let's talk about one of the most important, SALT, the state and local tax deduction. Ronald Reagan called the SALT deduction the most sacred of cows, and when his administration tried to get rid of it, the chairman of major New York-based corporations, such as Chase Manhattan Bank and American Express, teamed up with unions and mayors to go to war against it, and they won. Why? Here's how SALT works. Immediately following the constitutional amendment creating the income tax, The Revenue Act of 1913 created the SALT deduction, allowing individuals to deduct the amount in taxes they pay to state and local governments from their taxes to the federal government. The rationale was that if federal taxation got too high, it might absorb all the state's taxable resources, crippling local government. But looking at the modern era, what's happened is that it's allowed some states and local governments to raise their taxes and force the rest of the country to subsidize them. So states with high government spending, like California, Maryland, and New York, the state whose taxpayers benefit from the SALT deduction the most, are subsidized by the federal tax base from all states, including those that have worked to keep their government small and responsible, such as Alaska, North Dakota, and Wyoming, where people get the least from this deduction. The SALT deduction is also regressive, benefiting the rich and harming the poor. For those making under $50,000, SALT only saves them around 2% of their income, but for those making over $500,000, it saves them 7%. Getting rid of the SALT deduction seems like common sense, but politics makes it difficult. Blue states with big government are the primary beneficiaries of the deduction, so Democrats overwhelmingly stand opposed. And Republicans in those same states stand opposed too. Unfortunately, politicians have the incentive to protect what benefits their own voters, rather than what's fair to all Americans. And when it comes to tax reform, these states are just one of the many special interests looking to have their favored deductions protected. To learn more, click the link to the article on our website. I'm Kristen Eastlick. Thanks for watching.
On October 10, 2017, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt announced the repeal of the Obama administration's so-called Clean Power Plan. Here's the background. When he was running for president, Barack Obama told journalists that under his energy plan, quote, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket, unquote.
Electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket.
Democrats, who then controlled Congress, refused to pass the Obama energy plan. So to achieve the same goal, the Obama administration came up with his 460 pages of regulations, the so-called Clean Power Plan. This was supposed to fight global warming by cutting carbon dioxide emissions 32% by 2030 compared to 2005. But even according to the EPA's own computer model, the effects of the plan on the climate are minimal, that it would reduce the temperature by the end of the century by less than 1/50th of a degree, an amount that's too small for science to measure. They claim that the plan would reduce sea level rise by a whopping 1/100th of an inch. And this wouldn't come free. The plan was projected to hike electricity costs by more than 250%. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the economic impact of the Clean Power Plan would lead to a loss of about $1,700 for the average family of four by the year 2025. And that's the average family. Many towns in our nation were built around coal mines, and they've already been economically devastated, in part due to the effects of the Clean Power Plan. Meanwhile, countries that couldn't care less about global warming theory, Communist China, for example, would gain a tremendous competitive advantage over the U.S. as we deliberately impoverished ourselves. Rather than calling it the Clean Power Plan, a better name would be the Expensive Electricity Plan. Luckily, it's being repealed. It's now headed where it belongs, the ash heap of history. To learn more, click the link to the article on our website. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Named for 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, gerrymandering occurs when political districts are drawn to intentionally benefit a particular party or group. Two tactics are used in gerrymandering: cracking, diluting the voting power of the opposing party's voters across districts, and packing, concentrating the opposing party's voters in one district to reduce their power in others. In 1812, Governor Gerry signed a bill that redistricted Massachusetts to benefit his Democratic-Republican Party. Looking at the district on the map, it looked like a salamander, hence gerrymandering. But is the tactic why Republicans have achieved dominance in the House of Representatives today? Analysis suggests it's not as influential as you might think. Rather than deviously drawing district lines to benefit Republicans, studies show lifestyle differences can be more impactful in packing Democrats into districts. Democrats overwhelmingly cluster in cities, providing urban strongholds for the party, while Republicans are more likely to spread out, living in suburbs and rural towns. This causes natural district lines to benefit Republicans, and it would in fact require gerrymandering to mix suburban voters with Democratic urban voters in the same district. The Voting Rights Act also requires gerrymandering. The prevailing interpretation of the Voting Rights Act requires states to draw minority-majority districts, which have the effect of packing a Democratic-leaning constituency based on race. Both former President Obama and his Attorney General Eric Holder, now a leading Democratic Party gerrymandering consultant, support this interpretation, despite their denunciations of Republican gerrymandering. It's still true that in some states, gerrymandering has been used as a tactic to benefit Republicans, but from 1942 to 1992, Democrats heavily gerrymandered in their favor. Democrats continue using this tactic in many states, for instance Maryland, which in 2012 was gerrymandered to create absurd-looking districts that provide only one of the state's 8 members of Congress to Republicans. Neither party is innocent when it comes to gerrymandering for its own advantage. If we want to stop gerrymandering from benefiting Republicans, the answer can't be just switching the lines to benefit Democrats. As long as we have first-past-the-post voting, district lines will always benefit one party or the other. To learn more, click the link to the article on our website. I'm Michael Watson. Thanks for watching.
The U.S. is the largest consuming nation for minerals and metals. Yet over the past 4 decades, just as our standard of living and defense industry have increased demand for critical and strategic minerals and metals, the U.S. mining industry has been in precipitous decline. We now rank 7th in the world in mining output, forcing us to rely on imports from China, Russia, and other geopolitically risky countries. Why are we in this situation? One word: overregulation. 3 policy factors are contributing mightily to the domestic minerals downturn: an overly burdensome permitting process, environmentalist opposition, and vast tracts of public lands off limits to mining. That's a shame, because one of the largest mineralized regions on Earth occurs in the geologic terrain extending from Colorado to the Pacific Ocean across the western U.S. According to hundreds of U.S. Geological Survey reports, this mineral belt contains an amazing number of world-class deposits of critical and strategic minerals, including all-important rare earth metals used in everything from TVs to lasers. Yet the U.S. is 100% import dependent for more than 20 critical and strategic minerals. The industries that rely on minerals, such as construction and manufacturing, contributed $2.78 trillion to the domestic economy, or nearly 15% of gross domestic product. Such over-reliance on imports for 15% of our economy is dangerous when they come from our geopolitical foes such as China and Russia, both of whom have effectively used their resource wealth as diplomatic and trade weapons in the recent past. During a recent discussion of rare earths, a defense industry analyst unequivocally stated, "Absolutely, China could cut off the supply." As recently as 1993, the U.S. produced 33% of global rare earths elements. But by 2011, China accounted for over 95% of the world's rare earth production. The good news is that there is virtually no end to our nation's underground mineral wealth. The bad news is that there may be no access to these minerals if big government and the cabal opposing mining has its way. Scores of mining companies have gone under and tens of thousands of jobs have been lost over the past several decades. Secure access to critical and strategic minerals is a basic prerequisite to maintaining a thriving manufacturing industry, geopolitical strength, and a strong national defense, not to mention our standard of living. Decades of unsustainable public policy choices threaten to turn each of those national strengths into weaknesses. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
The Service Employees International Union, the SEIU, is the single largest contributor to federal political candidates in the United States. In total, the SEIU and its associated political action committees have spent over $270 million on federal politics and over $67 million on state and local partisan political campaigns, almost exclusively on behalf of Democrats and progressive causes. It's worth asking the question, why? What do they have to gain? Like all unions, they have a vested interest in enacting policies that will help them increase their membership and increase their dues collections. Like other unions, the SEIU is willing to be aggressive to make those things happen. When the SEIU wanted to unionize employees of food service provider Sodexo, the union's tactics proved so aggressive that the SEIU ended up settling a case Sodexo brought against the union in which the SEIU was accused of, quote, blackmail, vandalism, trespass, harassment, and lobbying law violations. And in the SEIU's campaign manual, they stated, quote, "It may be a violation of blackmail and extortion laws to threaten management officials with the release of dirt about them if they don't settle a contract. But there is no law against union members who are angry at their employer deciding to uncover and publicize factual information about individual managers." The SEIU has used their political spending to aid politicians in multiple states who have passed laws opening home health care aides up to unionization by the SEIU, forcing them to pay dues. Caregivers who objected to paying dues for nominal SEIU representation sued the state of Illinois, and in 2014, the Supreme Court ruled in the caregivers' favor, exempting home health care aides from forced dues. Given the focus on obtaining more dues revenue and political power, it's not surprising that the SEIU has been involved in multiple major corruption scandals. One leader pleaded guilty to charges related to over $500,000 of embezzled funds. Another directed $600,000 in contracts to his wife, used union dues to pay for his cigar club membership, and put $8,000 in wedding expenses on the union credit card. Caring about employees and making sure they have the power to negotiate with their employers successfully doesn't need to mean supporting unions if they've acted wrongly. Let's support employees, not their dues collector, the SEIU. To learn more, read our full article on InfluenceWatch.org. I'm Michael Watson. Thanks for watching.
It feels like America is more divided than it's been in decades. Getting along with those who disagree on politics has become difficult, tearing families and communities apart. It seems like now, politics isn't just about what you think, but who you are. It's personal. We've seen this feeling cause growing extremism on both ends of the political spectrum. The events in Charlottesville, Virginia, showed the ability of white nationalists to assemble off the internet and into the real world. Earlier that same summer, left-wing extremists essentially shut down Evergreen State College because a white professor dared show up on a day white people were asked to be absent from campus. And it seems like left-wing and right-wing extremists are just getting the other side even more riled up. There's a name for this problem, and it's called identity politics. Identity politics is the tendency for people of a particular race, religion, gender, or ethnicity to organize politically around that special interest for the sole purpose of advancing that interest without concern or regard for any larger group or collective. You might ask, what's so bad about identity politics? You wouldn't care about identity politics if it was your identity group being discriminated against. This is a misunderstanding of what identity politics is. There is a time for identities to come together when they are being discriminated against as a class, but the goal of these movements are only ethical when they seek to remove the political impact of identity, not enforce it. The civil rights movement is a great example. The civil rights movement was not identity politics. It was about destroying identity politics, creating a society where we'd see people as individuals rather than members of groups. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr.,
"Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today."
That's not in line with the recent push on the left to create black-only dorms at colleges, or women-only film screenings, or spaces without white people. Nor is it in line with those on the right who believe America should be a Christian-only nation, or want to mandate gender roles, and obviously not those who want a white ethno-state. Let's treat other identities as we would have them treat ours. There's beauty in different people with different ideas and of different backgrounds coming together to form America. But when it comes to politics and policy, let's treat people as people, recognizing and celebrating their unique characteristics as individuals instead of reducing them into an identity group. I'm Joseph Klein. Thanks for watching.
Americans across the political spectrum feel deeply that our government has become corrupt. Rather than serve the interests of the people, government frequently serves the interests of big business and special interests. How did this happen? It's what economists call regulatory capture. That's when a special interest group takes control of the regulatory process, and regulations, supposedly for the public interest, instead serve special interests. as when restaurateurs lobby government to limit the number of food trucks, or when government officials who used to be Wall Street executives bail out Wall Street banks. A special interest might push for regulations that are easy for them to comply with, but difficult for their competition. That's called a barrier to entry. Such was the case for the taxi industry when Uber came along. In order to keep out competition, taxi companies helped craft legislation on insurance, safety requirements, and pricing disclosure, which would have been expensive for Uber, but consumers didn't care about. Then there's when unions push for higher minimum wages when their workers already make above that wage in order to keep out cheaper workers. Sometimes special interests go directly for the money, seeking subsidies from you, the taxpayer, backed up by the force of government. Proponents of subsidies argue that they help fund things the free market wouldn't. High-speed rail, for example. But we shouldn't only look at what's created by subsidies, but also at what's destroyed. What else might the consumer have bought with their dollars if those dollars weren't taxed away? Whatever they might choose, we can know that when decisions are left up to the individual, they'll buy what they want, not what special interests want. We now live in a culture where many companies, rather than seeking first to serve the consumer, kiss up to politicians and bureaucrats to get subsidies and favors. Subsidies turn us into beggars rather than innovators. And with our nation over $20 trillion in debt, we simply can't afford this any longer. The solution is clear. Smaller, more limited government that doesn't have the power to dole out favors to those who have the money to lobby. To hear a key example of where subsidies for special interests have damaged Americans, watch our video on the Renewable Fuel Standard. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching. Ever notice at the gas station a sign describing your fuel as E10? That means 10% of your gasoline is actually ethanol. Wonder why that is? Because agribusiness lobbyists have managed to influence politics to obtain massive government subsidies and rewrite regulations to benefit their clients at significant cost to average Americans. The ethanol that's mixed with gasoline comes mainly from corn. The Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, originated with the Energy Policy Act of 2005. It mandates that a certain volume of biofuel be blended into motor fuels sold in the United States. The amount increases each year. Don't let the word renewable fool you. Renewable fuels are often worse for the environment than old-fashioned carbon-based fuels. About 40% of the U.S. corn crop now goes to produce ethanol. In the process, about 8.5 million acres of grassland and wetlands have been converted to corn plantations, destroying habitats and polluting water supplies. Fertilizer runoff from the Corn Belt makes its way down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, contributing to a process that has left a 5,800 square mile dead zone where aquatic life cannot survive. The RFS was supposed to reduce carbon emissions, but a leading environmentalist group reported that production and use of 14 billion gallons of corn ethanol resulted in 27 million tons more carbon emissions than if Americans had used straight gasoline in their vehicles. It's caused major issues for our economy, too. Economist Tom Eland estimated that in 2011, the higher cost of ethanol energy compared to gasoline added approximately $14.5 billion to the cost of U.S. gasoline consumption. And by increasing the price of corn, the commodities that compete with it, and of animal feed made from it, the mandate has increased the price of food. Estimates show corn prices are up 26.8%, soybeans 15.7%, pork 15%. Once upon a time, there was an argument to be made for the Renewable Fuel Standard, based on the idea that it would lower our dependence on foreign oil. But other types of technology, such as horizontal drilling and fracking, have actually put us on the road to energy independence. It's time to change government policy to benefit the taxpayer, not special interests. To understand the economics and politics of special interests, watch our video on the harms of subsidies and regulatory capture. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Once upon a time, there was a heroic organization of lawyers who fought violent white supremacists. They sued the Ku Klux Klan nearly out of existence, winning crushing multi-million-dollar jury verdicts for its victims. They also helped destroy the remaining vestiges of the Jim Crow South in the 1970s and removed legal obstacles to gender equality. But what happens when such an organization wins? when the Ku Klux Klan barely has any members left, and when legally enforced racism and sexism are nearly impossible to find, but you still have hundreds of millions of dollars in donations you need to do something with. Such is the story of the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization that has so succeeded in pushing bigots out of the mainstream that now, over 40 years after their founding, they need to constantly find new bigots inside the mainstream to fight against. When there aren't many left, that means dangerously expanding who is called a bigot. In 2009, the SPLC decided to go after Carol Swain, an African-American political science professor at Vanderbilt. They called her an apologist for white supremacy, despite the fact that she wrote a book studying and attacking white nationalism. Why? She'd once said something nice about a film that was, though she didn't know it, made by a racist. And it just so happened a month before, she had said the SPLC was improperly attacking conservatives. No longer heroic anti-racists, the SPLC have become a political weapon, and that's dangerous. The Family Research Council, a mainstream conservative think tank that advocates for mainstream conservative views, such as traditional marriage and restrictions on abortion, was put in the same category as the Klan by the SPLC, because of their Christian statements on homosexuality. The SPLC's report even inspired a mad gunman to shoot a security guard at the Family Research Council's headquarters. Because the SPLC still has some credibility, its political hammer does deep damage to discourse. For instance, its hate group labels were parroted by GuideStar.org, a popular website for information on charities. The charities labeled haters included the Center for Immigration Studies, whose mainstream executive director Mark Krikorian has testified before Congress and written for the Washington Post and the New York Times. Calling your political opponents bigots gets us nowhere as a society. It just inspires hate against people who have differing views. That's no way to reunite a divided nation. The only way to do that is with respect and tolerance, not harmful hyperbole. I'm Scott Walter. Thanks for watching.
Some say America's problems are far too great and complicated to be solved by Congress. They say Washington can't be trusted to fix itself, and that elections count for little because the government gets bigger and less accountable no matter who is in power. And so our national debt has skyrocketed to $20 trillion. That's $60,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. Many see systemic flaws within the American government, but fortunately the ability to update the structure of government was baked into our Constitution. The founders knew the Constitution was imperfect and that unforeseeable future events would require changes to it. Article 5 describes two different tracks for amending the Constitution, but only one of them has ever been used. In the process, used 27 times, a proposed amendment becomes part of the Constitution if it is approved by 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then further approved by ratification conventions in 3/4 or 38 out of the 50 states. Such amendments have guaranteed free speech, banned slavery, given women the vote, created the income tax, banned alcohol, and then, after that didn't turn out so well, legalized alcohol and limited presidents to 2 terms. The second method would let the states circumvent Congress. If 34 of the 50 states demand it, Congress must order a national constitutional convention at which state-selected delegates may propose amendments. Those approved by the National Convention then go out to the states for consideration. State legislatures may ratify the amendments, or state-level conventions may do so. If 38 states give them a thumbs up, the amendments become part of the Constitution. Supporters of this method already have 12 states on board, bringing them 1/3 of the way to the magic number of 34 states that compels Congress to order the convention. They propose changes such as a balanced budget amendment, redefining the General Welfare Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause that have been used to expand federal power, imposing term limits on Congress and the Supreme Court, and placing an upper limit on federal taxation. Could an Article 5 constitutional convention change the course of America? To learn more about the proposal, read the full article on our website. I'm Matthew Vadum. Thanks for watching.
Our legal system is supposed to be about providing justice for all. Unfortunately, some people use the legal system to circumvent justice and instead serve those who can afford powerful attorneys. Lawfare is the term for the use of law as a weapon, and lawfare is conducted on a regular basis. Lawsuit abuse can destroy small businesses and individuals who can't afford to defend themselves in our costly legal system. You may be familiar with the example of the Church of Scientology, which has filed thousands of lawsuits against newspapers, magazines, government agencies, and individuals whom they consider suppressive. Commenting on a lawsuit the church filed in 1955, its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, wrote, "The purpose of the suit is to harass and discourage rather than win. The law can be used very easily to harass," unquote. Another example is the Freedom Foundation, based in Olympia, Washington. It launched an outreach program to go door to door to inform healthcare providers of their right to opt out of paying dues to the Service Employees International Union. What the Freedom Foundation said was entirely accurate, but because its outreach program lowered SEIU revenues, the union and its affiliates orchestrated a legal assault on the Freedom Foundation, filing 3 lawsuits against it almost simultaneously. As a result, the Freedom Foundation's legal team has been inundated with increasingly intimidating subpoenas, depositions, and discovery demands. Now that they've already incurred $1.4 million in legal costs because of the attack, how does the Freedom Foundation's Tom McCabe budget for the future? He said, "You don't. You can't. It's impossible." The waste this causes our economy is drastic. The United States has the world's most costly legal system. Liability costs make up more of our economy than education or agriculture. So what's the solution? More than 25 states and the District of Columbia have anti-SLAPP statutes. SLAPP is short for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. Anti-SLAPP statutes have achieved significant success. Even more importantly, unlike the U.S., nearly every other Western democracy works on a loser pays principle, which means the losing side in litigation pays the winner's attorney's fees. It's time America adopts that same principle. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching. Teachers are important. A good teacher can change a life for the better, but a bad one can do serious harm. Unfortunately, teachers' unions have the same agenda all government workers' unions have, protecting their members at the cost of their employer. Not some big evil corporation, but rather you, the taxpayer. Teachers' unions have pushed for tenure for their members. While 1 out of 57 doctors loses his or her license to practice medicine, and 1 out of 97 lawyers loses his or her license to practice law, in many major cities only 1 out of 1,000 teachers is fired for performance-related offenses. One New Jersey union representative was blunt, quote, "I've gone in and defended teachers who shouldn't even be pumping gas." The difficulty of firing teachers led to the creation of rubber rooms, the nickname for reassignment centers where, until 2010, the New York City Department of Education at any given time had an average of 700 teachers accused of misconduct who would sit and do nothing, some for years, because the local union had made them so difficult to fire. Another common problem with teachers' union contracts is a bumping policy that fills schools which are more needy with greater numbers of inexperienced teachers. Children in the highest poverty schools are assigned to novice teachers almost twice as often as children in wealthier schools. And teachers' unions have repeatedly opposed charter schools and voucher systems that allow parents to choose where to send their children to school, locking students in schools with the bad teachers whose jobs the unions protect. Look at what happened in Seattle. School administrators in Seattle received at least 30 warnings that a 5th grade teacher was a danger to his students. Thanks to a union contract that forces schools to destroy most personnel records after each school year, he managed to evade punishment for nearly 20 years until he was finally sent to prison in 2005 for having molested as many as 13 girls. The lawyer for a victim said, "You could basically have a pedophile in your midst and not know it." The National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers aren't just fighting for good teachers, they're fighting for all their members. and that hurts kids. To understand how teachers' unions got all this power, watch our video on how government workers' unions control politics. I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen. Thanks for watching.
Sing a little louder than before. I want to jump higher than before. I want to shout louder than before. Yeah. Come on and say, freedom, freedom. Oh, God, I thank you for freedom. Freedom. I love you, Jesus, for freedom. I want to clap a little louder than before. I want to sing a little louder than before. I want to spin wilder than before. I want to shout louder. Yeah. Hey, I want to say, freedom, freedom. Hey, yeah. Freedom, 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 yeah, freedom. I want to lift my hands higher than before. I want to love you more than before. Yeah. I want to worship deep